I've been asked today to give an overview in relation to the new UK REACH regime. It's obviously a very complicated regime, so I'm going to try and keep it high level, but we will have some time for Q&A at the end, so we can pick up any points. So I wanted to just start. I mean, I know that actually based on the previous poll, most of the audience are fairly experienced exporters, so that means you might have been involved in import and export of chemicals already, but just to understand where we're starting from, and that's the EU REACH regime. So for anyone who's not particularly familiar with it, this is the regulation on the registration, evaluation, authorisation and restriction of chemicals. One of the main obligations is registration, and that's we're now talking about the EU regime, for EU manufacturers and importers of substances over 1 tonne per year. There's a regime which was created under EU REACH, which is duplicated in the UK scheme, of the ability for someone who is outside of the EU to appoint an only representative in the EU who can take on the duties of importers, because it's not always the case that the importers will be in a very good position to register a substance, particularly if they're importing a mixture. They won't necessarily have all the relevant information about all the substances in that mixture, certainly not enough to register it. So manufacturers outside the EU can appoint a representative to do that instead. Anybody further down from the importer or the manufacturer benefits from the registrations which are higher up in the supply chain. Other aspects of REACH which come into play are evaluation, which is effectively a review process by the regulator. Authorisation is about banning substances of very high concern unless they're specifically authorised. And restriction is about, as the name suggests, restricting certain uses of substances. So authorisation and restriction are the sort of control regimes. Registration is a self-assessment, self-registration regime. So that was our starting point. That's EU REACH. It used to apply in the whole of the UK. If I could have my next slide, please. So post January 2021, so at the end of the Brexit transition period, we now have a UK version of REACH. It's a standalone version of EU REACH. So whereas, and basically what's happened is that all the terminology has been transferred over, but it has a slightly different meaning now in many ways, because instead of thinking about manufacturers in the EU and importers into the EU, we have to think about manufacturers in GB and importers into GB. And so people who historically didn't have any obligations under EU REACH because they weren't importing into the EU, for example, if they were buying from the UK, they're buying in the UK from France or Germany, for example, but now they're importing into GB. So under the terms of UK REACH, they are now people who have got obligations that didn't before. That's one of the key changes, which I'll come back to in a minute. But just a quick, I'm jumping around a bit, but going back to the name and the application of it. It's applied in the UK since the 1st of January 2021, but it would be more appropriate really to name it GB REACH, because one important point to note is that EU REACH continues to apply in Northern Ireland. So under the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol, EU REACH is still applicable in Northern Ireland. Instead of ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, we now have HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, as our REACH regulator. HSE were always the UK competent authority under REACH, so they do know about REACH. They're used to enforcing and regulating REACH, but they've had to set up some really substantial new systems to deal with the whole of the registration system. So actions are needed effectively to comply with UK REACH. Those are primarily for GB companies who had EU REACH registrations, GB downstream users who are buying chemicals from EU and EEA suppliers, so those are the new importers, also companies that are relying on EU authorisations, and people who are relying on only representative arrangements that are already in place under EU REACH, because those will often need to be duplicated. So I've got a couple of slides which go through some of that in a little bit more detail. So can I have my next slide, please? So existing registrants. Now I'm talking here about a date that's passed. So hopefully none of you are hearing this for the first time if it applies to you. But just for completeness, I just wanted to explain what happened with respect to existing REACH registrants. So if you were a company in the UK that had an EU REACH registration, then you can do what was called grandfathering. So that basically just means transferring over your registration into the new regime fairly automatically. But it wasn't completely automatic. You had to provide some basic information to HSE by the end of April 2021 about the substances that you had registered. And you will, in due course, need to submit full registration dossiers under UK REACH, but there's no registration fee. I'll come on to the phase-in dates in a minute. I've got a slide with all the dates on it. And the other point for people who had existing EU REACH registrations was that in order to maintain access to the EU market, they also needed to transfer their EU registration to an EU entity before the end of last year in order to avoid it becoming invalid. So companies which were primarily manufacturing substances in the UK were having to grandfather their registrations and also transfer their registrations to an EU entity. So that's the main initial dates for that have gone by, but obviously we're now in this phase-in period, and so those companies will still have to be looking to submit full registration dossiers in due course. The more perhaps disruptive part is the next slide, please. And these are the new importers. So companies that were previously downstream users. So they were importing chemicals from somewhere in the EU, and those were registered by those suppliers somewhere in the EU, and therefore the GB companies didn't have to register. But those companies are now importers. They have two main options. Both of them involve submitting initially by the end of by 27th of October this year, what's called a downstream user import notification. I'm not entirely sure how we pronounce the acronym for that, but I'll call it a DUIN. So a DUIN must be submitted by somebody in respect of the import of this substance, if it's over 1 tonne per year, by the end of October 2021. And then a full registration dossier will need to be submitted for that substance according to the timetable, which I'll come on to in a minute. Now, obviously, as importers, new importers who were previously downstream users, a lot of these companies would not have been used to having to do REACH registration. They wouldn't have done it before. They wouldn't necessarily have all the information that's required. And so what can happen, and what we're finding is happening in a lot of cases, is that actually the supplier within the EU is appointing an only representative in GB who will take on those registration duties. And that only representative can submit the DUIN instead and then proceed to the full registration. Because a lot of companies who are importing these substances, perhaps in formulated products, just won't have access to all of the relevant information that they would need in order to submit a full registration dossier in due course. However, some companies are finding that actually they might have suppliers who are not going to sort of support registration under UK REACH. Perhaps, this company might be their only customer and it's not worth it for them. So there will be some companies who can't rely on these only representative arrangements and who will have to incur the costs of UK REACH registration in due course. And what we've been advising companies is that actually, if you're involved in these sorts of supply chains and you're not sure, you haven't seen concrete evidence that your supplier has appointed an OR and has submitted that DUIN, submit the DUIN yourself before the end of October, because then you get access to this phase-in period. You can have then 2, 4 or 6 years, which I'll come on to in a minute, before the full registration dossier is required, which gives you more time to negotiate with your supplier to get them to register, or potentially to find another supplier who's going to support UK REACH registration. The other point for sort of new importers and for downstream users would be that you also might need to think about EU REACH aspects as well. It's not just UK REACH that you need to think about, because you might be importing something into GB and you might just be selling it on back to the EU, or you might be formulating it into another product and selling it into the EU. So, you may still have to consider EU REACH, and your customers in the EU will also newly be importers under EU REACH. So they might have obligations that they didn't have before. They might be asking you about only representative appointments. So you have to think about it from both ends of the supply chain, really. And finally, on new importers, if you were importing from outside of the EU previously, so prior to Brexit, then you would have probably also been relying on an only representative arrangement. And that basically will need to be looked at to check whether that only representative arrangement has been grandfathered into UK REACH. So, even if you're importing from outside the EU and you were relying on those old arrangements, you'll need to check whether that's been effectively carried over into the UK scheme. So if I could have my next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through this in minute detail, but it's in here for information. The key deadline coming up, as you'll see, is this 27th October 2021, the date for the do-in submissions. And then there's the 3 phase-in dates. So if you submit, if you're either done your grandfathering notification, if you were a EU REACH registration holder, or if you do the do-in submission, then you get either 2, 4 or 6 years from 27th October, 28th October to submit the full registration dossier, and which period applies to you depends on the tonnage and the hazardous nature of the substance that's in question. So, for a lot of low volume, low hazard substances, you've actually got till the end of October 2027 to get the full UK REACH registration dossier in place. Can I have my next slide, please? I just wanted to mention authorisation and restriction under UK REACH. As I said, the registration is really one of the real key aspect, because that applies to all substances over 1 tonne per importer or manufacturer. But authorisation and restriction are worth knowing about. They are relevant to basically some of the more hazardous substances. So authorisation, as I said before, is about banning substances unless specific authorisations are granted. So the way that this works is that substances are designated as what's called substances of very high concern, SVHC, and they're put on a candidate list, the candidates for being subject to authorisation, and they go through a review process. And if they ultimately progress through that review process, they'll be prohibited. I mean, normally it takes several years for something to get to that stage. But after what's called the sunset date, the sort of cut-off date, then those substances can only be used if authorised. And authorisations are specific to individual companies and supply chains and uses. So you can only rely on an authorisation that you don't actually hold yourself if it's sort of immediately normally up or downstream of you in the supply chain, and also if you're using it for exactly the same purpose. Now, people within GB who were relying on, who either held an authorisation under EU REACH or they were relying on EU authorisations in their supply chain, could grandfather those into UK REACH. Again, it's a date which has gone, 1st of March 2021, notifications had to be made to the HSE. And effectively the authorisation status quo under EU REACH has been copied over into UK REACH. But what's happening now is that anything going forward will potentially be subject to UK REACH authorisation and EU REACH authorisation. They're not necessarily going to stay the same. And the first UK REACH authorisations have recently been granted. I think about 4 of them were granted a couple of weeks ago. So we are seeing, obviously now we've got a twin track process, and it's not necessarily the case that the same substances are going to be subject to the same authorisations at the same time under both regimes. Similarly, restrictions, this restricts defined uses of specific chemicals, and we just copied over, again, the existing EU restriction list into UK REACH, but going forward, the UK is looking at its own restrictions. So any new restrictions, any changes to restrictions under UK REACH will be UK specific. And the first ones have kind of gone up, started in the process. They're looking at lead in ammunition, and also the chemicals in tattoo and permanent makeup tattoos. and permanent makeup inks and those sorts of things. So that's in progress at the moment. So I just wanted to highlight that as a sort of an area which is developing and it's one of the areas where we're potentially looking at the divergence between the EU and the UK, possibly. If I could have my next slide, please. So just to round off, to try and draw things together, hopefully I've sort of managed to explain today that companies really do need to think about not just themselves, but their supply chains, because in order to work out what their obligations are, they need to know on a substance by substance basis what they're purchasing, where from, and what the status of their suppliers is under UK REACH and EU REACH. And then they also need to look at their sort of downstream as well, if applicable, in their finished goods. Is REACH applicable to their finished goods? So really do need to do a kind of audit mapping type exercise of what's my supply chain for this product, and where does, where are the REACH touch points, EU REACH, UK REACH, who's registered, who needs to register, is there an only representative, and then if applicable, the substance that I am selling, or the mixture I'm selling, the formulation, where does that fall within UK REACH and EU REACH? So it does require real close communication and collaboration between suppliers and customers. And, key things are looking at changes in status. So a downstream user becoming an importer is the real classic one, but only representative agreements that are no longer valid, new only representative agreements that need to be put in place. But it does need a real, I suppose, quite a forensic look at what you're buying and selling in terms of chemicals. So if I could have my next slide, please. I think that might be just my, oh yes, I'm not going to go through this, but I just included some links to guidance from HC and gov.uk. And late last year, we put together a sort of roadmap, a REACH roadmap. It's obviously, things have moved on a bit because that was written in November 2011, but there's still hopefully some useful stuff in there. So come back to those links if you are looking for more guidance. And I think is that my last slide? Yes. So hopefully that was helpful. Be happy to pick up any issues in Q&A, but I think you've got some more polls to go through first.
Yes, thank you very much, Anita. And like you said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them on the chat box or on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. In the meanwhile, we're going to launch 2 more polls to give you more time as well. I think I should be able to see it now. It's what have you considered in terms of customs declarations with the EU? We'll just give a couple of seconds for everyone to answer. Thank you very much. So we have a couple of companies doing their own customs declarations. We do have some using an existing customs agent. Some are still undecided, and some to some this does not apply. And we go now onto our final poll before we start with the Q&A. And we would like to know, how have you found the movement of goods since 1st January 2021? Just a couple of seconds more. And thank you to everyone who participated. Can you please go on to the next one? On to the next slide, please. Thank you. So whilst we start, you can go on to the next one. So whilst I'll just leave a feedback poll open for you whilst we start reading through the questions that we have on the chat. And the first one is, we buy PTFE Teflon powder from several global suppliers, one in the UK, a couple from the EU, and a couple from non-EU countries. if one of our suppliers is registering their PTFE under UK REACH, do we or the other companies also need to register? So they use the suppliers completely interchangeable.
Yeah. I think it's one of those questions where I'd probably need to unpick it a bit more, but in principle, basically, if the supplier, so let's think about the UK ones we'll put to one side, but if you're buying from a range of EU suppliers, each one of those EU suppliers would need to appoint an only representative to register for them in GB. So if, for example, one supplier had appointed an only representative to register, that would only cover the supplies from them. So each of those suppliers would need to have appointed an only representative in order to avoid you as the importer of that product having to register yourself as importer. And I know we have got, I've got a number of clients in a similar position whereby they've got perhaps one supplier who said they're registering with an OR and another one who hasn't. And in some cases, that might mean that you as importer do still need to register for the amount that's not covered by those supplier only representative relationships. I hope that's helpful. It's there's a bit more to it, but I think that was about as far as I could go. To keep it quite high level. Shall I go to the next one?
Perfect. Yes. So we have, if I am a manufacturer of electrical and electronic products located in the EU and my products might contain any restricted substances, what shall I do to comply to UK REACH?
Yeah, so if you are located in the EU, then it is your customers in GB who would need to think about their obligations under UK REACH if they're importing an article which contains more than 0.1% of a substance of very high concern. And so they would be responsible for, as a minimum, communicating down the supply chain, just as in the EU, the presence of that substance. If their imports go over the 1 ton mark of that restricted substance, then they might need to notify the HSE. But so primarily, so you as an EU manufacturer, unless you're also importing through a UK subsidiary, but let's say you're not in the UK at all, then it's really your UK customers. So from your point of view, you need to comply with your EU REACH requirements to communicate down the supply chain so they know what's in it so that they can comply with UK REACH. I think that hopefully covers that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We also have Stephen and probably some more people wondering if you are going to get the slides. Yes, you will. We will send a follow-up email in the following days with the slides and the recording as well, if you want to look back into it. We have another tip here. The HSE have an excellent helpline for companies on UK REACH, or talk to the IT and your dedicated international trade advisor who have chemical specialists on exporting.
Yeah, I mean, the HSE are very helpful. Yeah, I would agree with that. Because I would, on the contrary, I would say that actually their published guidance on the website can sometimes be less helpful. It can make some sort of assumptions and not include enough information. So if you do look at their guidance and it's not clear, then yeah, they are normally pretty good at clarifying or trying to clarify.
Yes, thank you very much. And we don't have any more questions for now. If we don't have any questions, if you can please go on to the next slide. So if you need any further support, or if you would like to get in touch with Anita as well for further support, you can just get in touch with us on our contact details here. We have our email or phone numbers. So you will get the slides. Feel free to get in touch with us if you need any further support. Thank you very much for everyone who attended, and thank you, Anita, for the great presentation.